Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Last time I talked about my entire story as an attractions cast member in Tomorrowland, as well as all my guest interaction stories from all three of my attractions that I worked. I also talked about what it was like working both Star Tours and Autopia in the previous two episodes. If you are interested in checking those out, a card probably just popped up to listen to those in like a playlist of all those videos and such. We are slowly approaching the end of this working the attractions arc for this little weird podcast thing I got going on here. This episode will be focused on working the monorail. For some context, Monorail was my second attraction I learned back in February of 2020, literally a month before the park shut down for the pandemic. This was also the main attraction I primarily worked upon its reopening in October of 2021 until my very last day in December of 2023. This episode will be covering what it was like working the attraction from my perspective and just sort of a general overview of the daily operations. I was also a lead at this attraction, so I was very knowledgeable when it comes to, operations and such, but as stated prior, this episode will mainly be focused on the general cast member side and not the lead side. That will actually be for the next episode. Also, I will not be covering any guests in this episode, but there might be some mentions, sprinkled in here and there. As always, this video will have chapters in the description or on the video itself if you want to skip around. Just a friendly reminder that this is a podcast and only somewhat related B-roll footage will be on screen as it's more meant for listening purposes. I also highly recommend having a somewhat basic knowledge of the monorail system, and I do have a video that covers the surface level operations of this attraction if you happen to never experience this attraction. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get this train moving. Womp womp. Daily CM Life. First things first, the Daily CM Life. This will be somewhat repeat information if anyone listened to the previous two episodes on Star Tours and Autopia, with slight details changed. Let's go ahead and start with a quick rundown of your shift. I would just wear my uniform before I left my house and commute in my costume. We were allowed to take them home, but you couldn't go around flaunting them in public for obvious reasons. Yeah, of course running into the store real quick was fine, and I was extremely comfortable in this costume. I was actually proud to wear this uniform and didn't really feel weird wearing this outfit in public. Besides all of that, we would park in one of the many cast member parking lots and either walk or take the cast member shuttles to our lands backstage. The monorail is on the far east side of the park, tucked behind the Autopia attraction and right above the Finding Nemo submarine attraction. Its entrance is really hard to miss if you aren't looking for it, and the official maps sort of do a piss poor job at showing where it actually is. This is also one of the two stations at this attraction, but we always clock in and clock out at the Tomorrowland one. I will get into the downtown station later. I would normally show up about 30 minutes early and wait backstage in the break rooms until it was about 10 minutes before my shift. I would always show up to this attraction early as getting a good radio was crucial, and there were some crappy radios. Also, getting your earpiece all hooked up to your radio took a hot moment, and if I worked on the evening side, I loved signing up to close a train or a specific position, depending on my off time. And I'll get into positions and closings later in the video. Basically, when it was clock-in time, it was get ready to work time. Now, with the monorail, there are no assigned positions. We were clocked in and we just jump into our position rotation, and I will explain that in a bit. The only time we would skip rotations was due to bumping someone out for a break, lunch, or their clock out time, with the occasional because the lead or manager told us to. Anyway, this will be from a full-time employee perspective of working 8 hours. You get paid, 2 15-minute breaks and an unpaid 30-minute lunch. This is sort of obvious for anyone who's worked any job, but I know labor laws are different in other states and countries. Anyway, all of those were already written out on a break sheet at both of the stations, so we knew exactly when to take our break and or lunch. You would work your entire shift, take your breaks, and clock out and leave. A nice part about this is that you clock out 20 minutes before your scheduled time, as Disney would pay us for our walk time back to our vehicles. So while you would be off at, let's just say, 11:10, you would actually be getting paid up until your scheduled off time of 11:30. Just as an example, of course. We also had options of early releasing and or overtime. Depending on staffing, sometimes we could request to go home early or stay longer than our scheduled shifts, but that's labor budgets and I will touch on that in the next episode, which will be the last in this arc. We also had the ability to trade shifts or give them away. Let's just say I trade with my coworker, they worked my Friday and I worked their Saturday, or I want a night shift and they want my morning shift on the same day. There was also the ability to straight up give away your shifts, but they were limited to 6 per year and 3 for part-timers, possibly more depending on manager approval. A side note, this actually went up to 12 for full-timers and 8 for part-timers with their newly ratified contract that they almost went on strike for. Anyway, let's go ahead and move over to positions. Positions. Every attraction has specific areas or tasks we do. The most common would be your pilot/driver for the monorail. This is actually the cast member that operates the monorail, and yes, the Disneyland version is actually driven despite what these idiot influencers say online. I will be covering all the positions at this attraction, but I'm not going into too much detail for legal and safety reasons. Obviously, I'm not going to tell you how to drive the monorail and that the pilot seat is meant for cast members only. Yeah, a quick pick is probably fine, but don't sit in the blue seat, guys. Anyway, let's work our way through the attraction. Upon clocking in, you start the rotation with the position closest to the side where the Matterhorn is at. We call it the Tomorrowland Post, and their job is to assist guests on and off from cabins 4 and 5, as well as the tail cone, and open the doors when it is safe to do so, when the train comes into the station basically. They are also in charge of sending the train when it is safe to do so, basically when the platform is clear, and they have heard the corresponding radio call that indicates that the other train has left the station or is in a specific zone when that is safe to do so. Oh yeah, this position is also in charge of assisting parties utilizing a wheelchair device and letting those in the tail cone and such, when available of course. Now this is the neat part about the monorail, but every time a train comes in, you would rotate positions. So the driver that just came in would come and bump the cast member at the post position, and that person would move their way to the brains of the attraction. We called it Monorail Central or Tomorrowland Central. This is the equivalent of the tower position at Star Tours, but instead of watching the monitors, they have to listen to all the radio calls. This position is also the person who clears the next train into the Tomorrowland station when it is clear to do so. Basically, when the current train is no longer in the station anymore and is in a far enough zone to do so, they would clear in this oncoming train into the station. Moreover, they also answer the phones and spiel to the station about the attraction rules and park hours and such. Next up, they also give the train the green light to go when the post cast member clears the train, but they have to make sure it is clear to send the train as a secondary precaution. Lastly, they are in charge of all cabins 3 and 4, but they usually are covered by another cast member who's floating around. There's also a high chance that there is a lead hanging around this area too, or someone in the next optional position is hanging around too. Now this optional position is a cast member that hangs around the photo cell area or by the first gate. They're usually there to control crowds and assist guests. They can go anywhere on the platform and they're not restricted to a certain area like the other two positions are. Now, staffing may not have this position all the time, so please listen to the spiels, especially during peak times, as they may not have this position staffed. Besides that, this is the floater that you would ask about sitting up in the nose cone with the driver when that's available, of course. After all these positions have been rotated, the next position is the driver. This cast member takes the train from the Tomorrowland station to the Downtown Disney station and repeats the process again at the other station. I'm going to get to the driver in just a moment as I want to cover the downtown's positions first. Now, they also have a post position that pretty much does the same exact thing, but they can go up to the third cabin instead of the fourth and fifth only. They also make sure no dummies go up the exit stairs or come to the exit near the elevator. Basically, this position is identical to the Tomorrowland counterpart, just a different station. The next position is a floater position, and that's the stager. They usually hang around the wheelchair ramp storage area and will assist the post cast member with wheelchairs. They may also block oncoming guest flow from tripping over the wheelchair ramp when it's down, but usually the driver does that if stager is not picked up. They can also help, but I guarantee they're probably slacking off and chatting with someone at the console position towards the front of the station. Speaking of that, this is the Downtown Disney utility position, and they don't have the same responsibilities as their Tomorrowland counterpart does. They have to spiel to the station and answer phones as well as, answer guest questions, but they don't have to worry about clearing the train into their station, as the downtown station always controls the flow of this attraction. They can send their train whenever the hell they want, as soon as they got the clearance from their post cast member and the station is clear, of course. Once they send it, the Tomorrowland station can finally send theirs. Now let's finally talk about the driver. This is the most crucial position there is at the entire attraction, as they're the ones driving the train. The train is pretty straightforward when it comes to driving, as it only goes forward and backwards. No turns to worry about. They also make their designated radio calls in certain zones or areas. They use these zones also to manage their speed. Just for the sake of this video and not to go into too much explanation, the trains go up to 30 miles per hour outside of Disneyland Park and up to 15 miles per hour while inside of Disneyland Park. They will always come to a slowdown as they approach the station, entering the stations at 10 miles per hour, then down to 5 miles per hour when they get to the halfway point, and then hitting 0 once the red light goes to a solid red color and not, blinking red. It makes more sense when you see it in person, and I explained this in more detail in my surface level operations video. Besides all of that, the driver also rotates each time they get to the station, repeating the process I stated earlier. Yeah, there are some times where the same driver might stay in the train for a round trip, or another driver might skip rotation as they're coming back from their break and or lunch. They may also double up in the nose cone depending on staffing, or they need to clock out. It's nitty-gritty details that I don't really need pointing out, but I just figured I'd mention them. Now, there's one position that I actually left out, and that's the optional greeter position. Since this attraction does not have a height requirement, they normally do not have a greeter staffed. The most common times you'll see one is at the Tomorrowland entrance when there's a downtime or they're getting ready to close for a fireworks show or ready to close for the night. Yes, there are times where they might just have it picked up due to overstaffing, but they might be moving strollers in the Nemo parking area, or they might be just doing something around the area. This position is also part of rotation, and the unwritten rule is you always are supposed to ask when you rotate every time you come back to the Tomorrowland station, but not a lot of people did that. There were multiple times where I was stuck down at the position for like an hour or two. Granted, there were some days I didn't mind, but I did like driving the train as it was my favorite position. A little too much, I would even say. I will get into that in a later video, or possibly in my final reflection video of, this entire series. But, yeah. As you may have noticed, there's not many positions here at the monorail, and that's okay. This attraction really only needs 6 people to operate, with a 7th being a breaker. It's time to move on to the next part of this video and talk about the opening and closing procedures. Opening and closing procedures. Every attraction has both their opening and closing procedures. They basically make sure everything is up and functional in the morning before the parks open, and make sure everything is put away and or off for the closing time. Every attraction has different ways of doing their own procedures, and I will only be talking about the ones that I worked. Obviously, this video will specifically be on the monorail. Starting off with opening procedures. It starts bright and early, about 2.5 hours before Disneyland's opening. Early entry days included. The lead sends 2 drivers back to the roundhouse, or as we called it, the monorail shop. This is the building that, has the train stored in there, but the monorails are on the 2nd story. Each of the drivers gets the clearance from the shop cast members and hops into their respective train. There are 3 trains in total, but there's only usually 2 in operation for the day. They'd never run 3. We're going to go ahead and follow along the first driver for this scenario. Upon entering the first monorail, the driver does a check inside the nose cone. They make sure all the buttons work, radios work, typical things you expect from, daily checking. Then they get clearance from both the monorail central cast member in the Tomorrowland station, as well as the shop cast member to back up their train at a speed of 1.5 miles per hour until they get past that block light that indicates that there's power to the beam. Once they get to that spot, they turn off their train and put the train into a normal operation mode, as they're actually in what we call a maintenance mode when they're operating on the storage beam. It's like an administrator override for your desktop computers. Once they have powered back up their train, the shop customer moves the connector part of the beam, or basically the track switch, from the storage over to the regular loop. Once they do that, they power back on the beam and make sure it's good on both their end as well as the customer over in Tomorrowland. Then, the driver powers up the monorail and gets clearance to the Tomorrowland station. As they pull into the station, they come to a full stop and then open up all of their doors. This is when the extra cast members who just clocked in assist by checking all the cabins, intercoms, and other safety things that you make sure they're all good inside each of the cabins, excluding the nose cone that's already been done by the driver. After this, the driver takes the 2 floating cast members with them to the downtown station so they can get ready and open up their side of the station for daily operations, but I'll get into that in a moment as we're talking about the Tomorrowland cast members first. Once the driver has left the Tomorrowland station, they give the clearance for the other train to leave the shop, and they repeat the same process all over again. The only exception is that the first train waits in the downtown station until the second train has made its way back to the Tomorrowland station. This is where things get interesting and they now test the intrusion system. A quick explanation, you remember how I was talking about these zones earlier? Well, there are 18 zones in total, starting with Zone 1 in the Tomorrowland station, all the way to Zone 18 coming back into the Tomorrowland station. You might be able to see this when you ride up front with the driver, but just know it's not really important to the average guest. It's important to the monorails as the intrusion system communicates with both the beam and trains, letting the onboard computers know that there is a train in this zone. Basically, 3 zones apart is green, 2 zones apart is yellow, and 1 zone apart is red, which will give the train an automatic emergency stop. This is the thing that they test in the morning and every morning for all that matter. They also do this whenever a new train is added for the day or any modifications are done to the intrusion system, but maybe I'll get into that later. So, testing the intrusion system means the trains literally have to try to intrude upon each other from each of these stations. They have to make sure they get that auto emergency stop, in the red zone. If they do not get this emergency stop, they will have to redo the testing until they tried it basically 3 times. Basically, they try to ram each other for a good half an hour and make sure the computer system is working. If it doesn't, then the driver would make the emergency stop on their own. Let's quickly move over to the other 3 cast members before I, keep going into more detail. Starting off with the Tomorrowland cast member. They come in about 15 minutes after the drivers do, and they do their normal checks around the station. They make sure all the intercoms, phones, and radios all work at their station and queue. They are also in charge of giving their radio calls to both the trains and the shop customers for the intrusion testing that I was just talking about. It's a long script, but the gist of it is they tell them exactly what to do, what speeds to do it at, and when to call in when they got that emergency stop. They have a little printed out booklet that tells them exactly what to do, but if you've done this as many times as some of us have, you pretty much have it memorized by now. Now for the Downtown Disney cast members. They do the same exact thing over at that station, but they don't have to worry about making those same radio calls as the Tomorrowland cast member. They just hang out until they finish their checklist, and they're about ready to open for the day. I actually opened this position a lot as I was one of the higher seniority cast members upon reopening, and it was great because I got to basically chill and such. Easy money. Now it's time to move over to closing procedures. This starts about 30 minutes prior to park closing. Everyone gets into their signed up closing position based off their clock out time. This is actually where the greeter becomes a required position to both inform everybody that's a one-way trip to downtown station, as well as closing up the chain when the clock hits closing time, which is usually midnight. Yeah, the monorail starts kicking people off at the other station about 30 minutes prior to park closing, so do not try to do a round trip at this time. The other position that is a floater in the Tomorrowland station, as well as the postcast center at the same station. They do their jobs as normal, except the floater just makes sure there's no more stragglers for the last train of the night. Basically when they close up the chain. Now next up is the cast member who closes the central position in Tomorrowland, and their job is to spiel to everyone that it's one-way trips only, as well as do the closing procedures for putting the trains away, which I'll get into in a moment. The last 4 positions are the 2 drivers and the positions at the downtown station. Starting with the downtown station cast members, they make sure everyone leaves that station, as well as informs the ticket takers that there's no more guests coming out of the trains so they can close up for the night. They will also ride back with the second train driver, but again, I'll get into that in a moment. The first train driver departs the Tomorrowland station and makes their radio calls for what they call a deadhead. Basically, they're taking this train offline and put it away for the night. As they get to the downtown station, they do a walkthrough of all their cabins and make sure there's no guests trying to stow away, including the tail cone. Once they have done this, they are sent on their way and make their way to the block light where the track switch is for the storage beam. The second train will most likely be holding in the downtown station by then. Once they're holding at this spot, they power down the beam for this area and switch the tracks over to the storage beam, making radio communications with the Tomorrowland cast member to make sure everything is secure and such. Then they power down the train and put it back into this maintenance mode that I was talking about to get onto the storage beam, as technically this storage beam isn't part of any of those zones and just reads Zone 0. They have to do something called feathering for this part, where they slowly adjust the throttle between 0 and 5 miles per hour to get a nice 1.5 miles per hour. They do this all the way until they get over the train tracks, but then it sort of locks into that speed. But they still have to hold on to the throttle's dead man for safety reasons. After that, they slowly come to a stop inside the shop and make their 10-7 call, which is basically saying that they put their train away for the night. After all of this is where the second train will make its way to do the same exact thing, except they have the downtown station cast members aboard. Yeah, pretty interesting stuff for this operations, and it truly was a pleasure working at this attraction. I opened and closed trains so many times that it was a treat and a half to do so. I actually closed a train on my last day at the company, and it was a blissful treat making my final 10-7 call. Anyway, let's go ahead and move on to the next chapter. The working environment. Like Autopia, this attraction also has 3 periods that I worked at. The short month before the closure, the reopening phase in late 2021 to becoming a lead in late 2022, and then the fantastic year of 2023. I want to iterate that fantastic is in quotation marks because I'm being sarcastic. It was not fantastic. Anyway, the upside of this attraction is considered a third attraction, and that means new hires cannot come to this attraction day 1. They have to have worked in the land and attractions for at least 8 months and already have 2 attractions under their belt. I was part of the exception as this was my second attraction, but that's because I was at Autopia for 8 months. Some other people also got this as their second attraction, while others got Space Mountain as their second, but I'm not going to get into that nitty-gritty detail here. The important thing is that not many idiots could waltz up to the monorail like they did in the new hire attractions like at Autopia and Star Tours and Buzz Lightyear and Finding Nemo. Those are all new hire attractions. Yeah. Now, the month prior to the closure was me learning this attraction as well as working it off and on for the next few weeks. This was also the only time I ever had guests up front with me, as they were not allowed back in the front until recently, as of like last month, September 2024 recently. Nonetheless, it was a breath of fresh air, and it was nice being in an environment where everyone was super friendly. I also got to experience some of the shenanigans my coworkers played at this attraction. Like shenanigans as in, they like to leave the train in reverse for an unsuspecting driver to not see this, and end up taking off backwards when they leave the station. It was funny as all hell, and we had good fun as it was a once in a blue moon prank. You know, I was even gotten a few times by it. The next story isn't mine to tell, but some of you may recall this rumor of a Home Alone VHS tape being placed in the rafters at the downtown Disney station. Well, I did not experience this firsthand as I was not working at the resort at this time, but I can tell you got to hear it from, the story from a few of my coworkers who were there that night. Basically, one of my coworkers got bored and climbed up the station and put a VHS tape of Home Alone there, and basically see it if anyone would notice. Well, it didn't take long as it was apparently gone within the week as someone posted it to Reddit and other social media platforms. Apparently management was furious about this prank and no one ended up getting in trouble. The only thing I can tell you is that none of these people actually work at the resort anymore, and they have all left the company even before I even left. You can sort of tell the vibe of working here was like pre-pandemic. Well, post-pandemic and the reopening phase was a different story. We were all glad to be back, and we started cycling the trains in August of 2021, with the eventual reopening to guests in October of 2021. I ended up getting signed off a week before the reopening, and driving the trains around all day and hanging out with the monorail crew was the best, until we actually had to get back to work. We didn't mind though, as we actually had to work again, but I can tell you that the next year was rough. We were super short-staffed as we were running out of people that actually had monorail knowledge prior to the shutdown, and it was dwindling every day as people were quitting in masses due to the toxic guests and piss-poor management, unfortunately. To make things somewhat worse, Nemo was starting to slowly reopen, and that took half of our already skeleton crew we had at the monorail. So basically now we were all working overtime for months. My only break was a 6-week leave to take care of my daughter at the time, as she was born during this time. Once I got back from that, it was back to working 6 days a pay period, which sometimes was 13 days in a row. 8 to 12 hour shifts. Man, it was exhausting. The only nice part about all of this is that we were having a bunch of technical issues with the trains, as they were not ready to reopen. And on top of that, we were also closing at 7 p.m. Every night due to severe understaffing, both from the monorail shop cast members as well as their own. They did start to train new people in early 2022, and they were luckily, people that hired in pre-pandemic. None of these post-pandemic dummies ended up here until mid to late 2022, which I'll get into that in a little bit. While the hours were long, we all sort of bonded together, and I can tell you part of working the monorail was something I looked fondly over. We were all doing our shenanigans with each other, as well as bonding like a work family should. I truly loved my job up here, and I enjoyed working with everyone that came up here. That is, until some of the post-pandemic dummies came up here, This batch of people weren't as bad as they have been, as you know, they've had some time to learn the attraction operations by now, but I started to notice a lazier trend amongst my coworkers. I was also gearing up to become a lead or trainer at any of my attractions, and somehow this was the one I ended up at. I mean, I was at it 90% of the time, but even I'm shocked to this day that I still got it. Looking back though, it's because we were desperate for leads, but at the same time, I ain't complaining. I got something cool. I won't be talking about lead stuff in detail in this episode, as that will be for next episode's topic, but just know I did end up losing my status towards the end of March of 2023, and that was the beginning of the end for my time at Disneyland. If you really want to know my full cast member story, I recommend listening to the first episode in this podcast series, as this arc is more focused on the attractions themselves. Speaking of that, around late 2022, we ended up going back to normal operations and closing with the park. That's because staffing was starting to balance out and the overtime up here was slowed down. The crazy thing though is that we were still training new people every week up until the day I left in very late 2023. 2023 was also the period where it was just regulars who worked up here, with the small handful of those who just got signed off and would never see this attraction again after their post, 2-week training shifts or whatever. Basically, it was weirdly chaotic, but management was being in a leadership role, until I lost it, of course. After losing my status up here, I ended up switching to mornings until I eventually dropped down to part-time in August of 2023. I was then working nights again, on weekends, and started to become more and more pissed off here. What once was my home attraction was taken over by lazy coworkers and new people that barely knew what the hell they were doing. I also couldn't talk to any of them because I was denounced as the lead up here, and it was just all sort of a blur, to be honest. The only thing I remember from this time was that a lot of my close acquaintances and friends just said I looked angry all the time now. I also started creating more content and basically started focusing on that when I wasn't working and or watching my kid. It really helped me cruise by and helped me deal with this fallout of losing my status, as well as some of the bullcrap I was dealing with at work. A lot of that is losing my status, and the aftermath of that are closely related, so I'll be saving that for the next episode, unfortunately. So this will be a two-parter. The fortunate part is that now I have time to talk about the operations. So operations. The thing with the monorail is when they worked, and when they didn't, whoo boy. I can count the amount of times that I've been towed in a train on more than two hands. I was actually towed a total of 14 times during my 3 years at the monorail. This was just me and the train, by the way, not other times it happened to other cast members. I can tell you, even some of my coworkers that have worked at the monorail for decades have never seen the trains get towed this much in such a short period of time. This was all due to newer shop cast members, as well as, literally making do with what they got. I went into this in a bit more detail in my Decline of Disney Parks video that's not attached to this series, but it's worth a watch if you're interested in that. The gist of working with what they got is that the pandemic really screwed over a lot of stuff, and parts were very, very, very scarce, as in no longer being made, so they literally had to Frankenstein things together. I mean, Disney is a multi-billion-dollar company and should have figured this out, right? I'm not going to get into the politics of Disney and their piss-poor handling of the parks as of late, but just know that I saw your frustrations of the attraction reliability firsthand of all 3 of my attractions post-pandemic. So much so that the day I lost my status, I got stuck in a train for over 2.5 hours, literally inches away from the roundhouse's roof. I almost had to be evacuated by the Anaheim Fire Department that was on standby, only for the maintenance team to say, "Yay, we fixed it." Good times. I even have an instance where the train got stuck out on Harbor Boulevard and someone complained about it on Twitter. Hopefully I slapped that tweet up, but I know I mentioned it in my guest complaints video on the monorail. Anyway, there's this one in December of 2021 where the train was pretty much getting towed every single day. I just remember that we all got in really good shape as we had to walk from the downtown station back to the Tomorrowland station and back a lot during this time. There was also this one day that I got stuck in red for over 5 hours right next to before entering the Grand Hotel because the intrusion system failed and the whole beam blew out. They literally had to go to each pillar that has the intrusion nodes and fix them all. That was a good day. Spent the first 2/3 of my shift sitting in a train with some hotel guests just staring at me. Good times again. Speaking of that, I do have a favorite train, and that was blue. Orange was second, and red was below the goddamn tractor that tows the monorails. You know, red is a devil train, and I hated it. Granted, I got towed in that goddamn train at least 6 or 7 times of my total of 14. So you can see why I wasn't a huge fan of it. I think my favorite story with this train is when it blew a load tire going up the grade above the Autopia, and it was so loud that the windows of cabin 4 shattered. I mean, I really feel for the guests that were in that cabin, as it was apparently so loud that the entire park heard it over the ambience music. I didn't realize how loud a load tire would be, but dang. I was also in the downtown station at the time, but low-key my buddy and I thought it was really funny because that train was a nightmare despite what all these clowns say about it. Remember, blue is the best, orange is good, and red should be in the trash. Don't worry, I have fun stories with blue too. You know, that fancy new wrap that caused a lot of issues where the wrap was messing with one of the train's sensors, and an engineer had to override the Tomorrowland station so he can open the gates. Basically, the Tomorrowland station hates the Blue's, 100th anniversary wrap so much that it locks the gates and tells them we can't load the train, even though there's nothing wrong with the train. It's probably still like that today, at least it was when I left. I don't know if that wrap is still on Blue, but that wrap also blinds people at a certain point of the day because of how goddamn shiny it is. You literally can see it coming from a mile away with, the California sunbeams onto the train. We used to make jokes about how looking at the trains behind you, but not blue because you go blind. Literally, it was that shiny that it would blind people coming into the park over the Nemo Lagoon. Orange also had its own issues with terrible AC in the nose cone, to the tail cone door just straight out not opening anymore. I recall a story of the tail cone door just popping off one day, and a poor maintenance cast member had to hold it in place as they took it back to the shop to get fixed. Good times again, man. Speaking of AC, the monorails don't have AC on board in the normal cabins, so we have to shut down for heat, and I had a whole section of guest complaints on that. Apparently, they did actually have AC units installed, but they couldn't fit outside the shop's doors. So they had to be scrapped, and they put the Mark V windows that are currently on the Mark 7. That's what I was told from a veteran customer, but I can believe it. That goddamn train is literally held together by duct tape and literal magic. I will go more into the unfortunate upkeep with the trains in my lead video, because some of the stuff that I saw with those trains firsthand was nuts. Nothing as crazy as some of the other leads have experienced, but a ton of stuff that was just insane, both physical and digital. I could keep going on and on about it, but I just want to let you know that it has been slowly fixed over time, and for the most part, I believe the trains work for the most part nowadays. It was considered weird that the monorails had a perfect day with nothing going wrong. I mean, there was always the occasional e-stop from going too fast in a certain zone, to trying to go reverse when the train was still moving forward. I'm talking about issues that literally had, us down for the rest of the day to sometimes even weeks. Even when I did lose my lead status up here, a lot of people had my back and felt like management made a mistake removing it. It was a hard recovery, but I don't regret staying up there even after losing my status. The staff up there were extremely friendly, and that's what makes this whole operations fantastic. A lot of my coworkers on the morning and afternoon side really made this attraction worth working, and I can tell you a ton of them have gotten numerous guest compliments during their tenure. I can't speak for today's standards as staffing has changed, but I think that's what made the operations good. That's going to wrap it up for this jumbled mess of a podcast video thingy. The next episode I will be talking about what it was like being a lead at this attraction, and the following episode will be the last in the series where I reflect on the past year of no longer working for the mouse, as well as discuss some of the things that don't really fit into the narrative for these videos. I loved this attraction until I was able to take a step back and really get a good look at my life at this company. Going part-time and leaving was probably the best decision I physically made, even if it hurt, financially. I hope I didn't bore too much of y'all with my technical stuff, but let's go ahead and finish up these last 2 episodes strong or something. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you liked it and want to help support my channel, go check out some of my other content. I have a variety of skits, films, and other series you might enjoy. I even did a gaming hour episode on the recent release of Astrobot, and that was a hoot and a half to play. There's even this Disney video about the decline of the parks that isn't in this series, as it's me talking on a green screen. I would highly recommend checking it out if you haven't already, as I get more into the personal stuff of how I feel towards the parks, something I don't really do in this series. Other than not all that stuff, Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.